Lena Morris had no illusions about suburban life. She wasn't one of those people who dreamed of white picket fences, block parties, or waving to neighbors with a steaming cup of coffee in hand. For her, moving into the quiet cul-de-sac on Forest Glen Drive had nothing to do with community spirit or nostalgia. It was a matter of logistics and peace. After over a decade of working in the unforgiving environment of state-level land use law, she had grown to appreciate quiet structure, not just in statutes and policy, but in her own living space. The home she purchased, a modest single story with a wide front lawn and stone walkway, wasn't her dream home, but it was functional, solid, and private. That privacy mattered. Lena's career revolved around property lines, zoning codes, municipal overreach, and public land disputes. She had built a reputation as a detail-oriented, relentless specialist who could navigate land use law like a surgeon threading a scalpel between muscle and vein. She didn't litigate in the theatrical sense. Her victories came from well-documented submissions, surgical strikes in hearings, and knowledge so precise that it made opposing counsel afraid to underestimate her twice. It was a lonely, demanding type of work. She didn't mind. Lena was the kind of person who read soil reports with a highlighter. Her new house sat on a slightly elevated lot with a clean slope, giving her a view over the street without being too exposed. The neighborhood was mostly occupied by longtime residents, some retirees, a few dual-income couples in their late 50s, and a handful of widowers who still mowed their lawns every Saturday morning out of muscle memory. From the moment she moved in, Lena kept a low profile. She waved when waved to, answered politely when asked where she was from, and never initiated conversations. She didn't join the walking groups or the monthly wine and cheese evenings hosted in the brick home on the corner. Her routine was neat and unobtrusive. She worked long hours from her home office, took early morning walks in silence, and maintained her front lawn herself. Not out of thrift, but preference. There was something meditative about controlling the shape and height of her own grass, especially after a day spent in abstract legal theory or heated code dispute meetings. It didn't take long for her to notice that this neighborhood had its own rhythm. Cars were parked in the same driveways. Kids were practically non-existent, and the few pets that wandered about were always leashed and meticulously cleaned up after. The air was calm, the trees trimmed, and trash bins never stayed on the curb longer than necessary. There was, of course, a local governing body, informal in its demeanor but rigid in effect. The Residential Oversight Committee, unofficially referred to by neighbors as the Board, was made up of 5 self-elected volunteers, most of whom had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years. They had no government power, no legal authority per se, but over time they had grown into something greater than their founding paperwork suggested. Their influence was built not through legal mechanisms but through subtle social pressures, fear of property value depreciation, and a culture of unquestioned compliance. They issued guidelines rather than orders, but failure to follow those guidelines always resulted in consequences. Sometimes delayed, always calculated. Lena hadn't paid them much mind. As a professional, she knew exactly where their reach ended and where personal ownership began. She wasn't belligerent about it. She simply lived by the boundaries defined in her own deed and local ordinances. That was enough. Or so she thought. The first letter arrived on a Thursday. It was a standard envelope with no return address, slid into her mailbox among utility bills and a circular for a local pharmacy. She opened it without suspicion and read the contents standing over her kitchen counter, the envelope still dangling from one hand. The letter was printed on white paper with an oddly formal serif font and read more like a memo than a notice. It informed her that she had been found in violation of Landscape Maintenance Protocol 4B, specifically for self-maintaining the turf and edging of her front yard without the consent or coordination of the designated landscaping contractor under us, the Forest Glen Residential Maintenance Partnership. For this violation, she would be assessed an annual fee of $1,000, payable in quarterly increments. A deadline was included, so was a payment slip. No contact name, no direct appeal instructions. Lena read it twice, then once more, slowly. The language was carefully vague. It didn't claim she had damaged anything. It didn't suggest her work had disrupted the appearance of the neighborhood. It simply stated that by mowing her own lawn and not utilizing the partnership-approved contractor, she had violated a policy and owed money. She folded the paper neatly and placed it on her desk beside a stack of zoning applications she was reviewing for work, then made herself a cup of coffee. There was no anger, No alarm. Only a shift in mental posture, the subtle click from passive to analytical. She had dealt with worse, but even still, something about this rubbed her the wrong way. The following day, she walked the neighborhood slowly, looking for signs. The grass on most lawns was neatly cut, but the patterns varied. Some with wide riding mower stripes, others with delicate trimming around flower beds. That meant not everyone used the same service. She noted 5 homes in a 3-block radius that clearly had different mowing methods, including one house where a homeowner was actively trimming bushes with electric shears. No one else seemed concerned. No other lawns bore contractor signs or partnership placards. On Saturday, she called the number listed on a community bulletin pinned near the mailboxes. It rang 3 times before someone picked up. The voice identified itself as Karen Whitmore, chairperson of the neighborhood's Oversight Committee. Lena introduced herself politely and mentioned the letter, asking for clarification. Karen's voice was friendly but firm, clipped with the kind of confidence that came from years of not being questioned. "Oh yes, we sent that out. It's a standard letter for residents who attempt independent maintenance without registration. You'll want to register with the approved service provider if you wish to avoid future charges," Lena pressed. "I reviewed the county records and my property deed. I wasn't made aware of any mandatory maintenance agreement, nor is it in the disclosures I received at closing." Karen chuckled gently, as though Lena had asked an adorably naive question. "Oh, that language doesn't usually appear in the official documents. It's just how we do things here. Keeps things orderly." Lena's tone sharpened slightly. "Is this program legally enforced?" Karen paused just long enough for it to be noticeable. "It's community enforced, which in many ways is even more important." The call ended soon after. Lena made no threats, didn't raise her voice, didn't mention her profession. She simply thanked Karen for the information and hung up. That night, she reviewed the entire covenant agreement attached to the property. It was thin, only 8 pages. Nowhere in it was there mention of mandatory participation in any exclusive landscaping program. What she had received wasn't a formal infraction. It wasn't even enforceable. It was pressure disguised as procedure, and she wasn't being targeted by accident. 3 days later, someone left a new note on her front door in the same font as before. "Final reminder, your failure to coordinate lawn maintenance through the designated partnership program is affecting neighborhood cohesion. Continued non-compliance will result in further action." Lena stared at the paper, then looked up at the street. A car sat idling across the road, an older sedan with heavily tinted windows. She couldn't see inside, and after a few seconds it pulled away. She knew what this was now. It wasn't about grass, it was about control. Lena didn't act immediately after the second notice. She let the weekend pass without response, using the time to monitor the neighborhood with the same quiet precision she applied to reviewing public zoning maps. Nothing seemed unusual on the surface. Lawns were mowed, sidewalks were swept, and no one appeared to be under similar scrutiny. The only thing that stood out was the timing. Since moving in, she hadn't joined a single event, signed up for any community newsletters, or contributed to their vague improvement fund. She had received the fee notice exactly 2 days after declining a neighbor's passive-aggressive offer to help her integrate into the committee system. That meeting had taken place at Karen Whitmore's home, a red brick colonial with decorative shutters and a perfectly circular rose garden that looked more like a controlled experiment than natural landscaping. Lena had politely declined and made no further contact until the letter arrived. Coincidence didn't suit this place. On Monday morning, Lena drafted a formal letter addressed to the Oversight Committee, requesting a copy of the contractual basis for the lawn care fee. She used standard administrative language, citing applicable disclosure obligations, deed covenants, and municipal property use statutes. She printed it on her work letterhead, not from a personal angle, but with the neutral authority of her office. She mailed one copy and delivered another by hand, sliding it through the mail slot of the community office. A converted garage space attached to Karen's property. No one was present, but a small camera above the door blinked as she stepped back onto the sidewalk. By Wednesday, she received an envelope with no stamp. It had been hand-delivered. Someone placed it in her mailbox overnight. Inside was a terse response typed in bullet points. It listed the date of her infraction, the amount owed, and a vague reference to Neighborhood Maintenance Order Nonirmamo 17, a supposed internal rule passed by majority vote. No signatures, no official seal, no mention of legal enforceability. The letter ended with the phrase, "Continued resistance will jeopardize your standing as a community member." That last line was underlined twice in red ink. Lena's instinct told her that this was no longer about money. It was a social maneuver, a flex. This wasn't her first encounter with small-scale power structures hiding behind bureaucratic phrasing. In her line of work, she had watched tiny town councils try to reclassify zoning overlays to keep out undesirable builds, always dressed up in language about aesthetics or tradition. This was no different, only more personal. The real catalyst, however, came later that week when she returned from a client site visit in a nearby township. She pulled into her driveway as the sun began to dip behind the hills and noticed a subtle change to the front yard. The grass had been mowed. Not the full lawn, but just a precise strip down the center. Exactly 6 feet wide, running like a landing strip from sidewalk to front porch. The blades were cut slightly shorter than Lena ever trimmed them, and the edges were jagged. There was no clippings mess, no tools left behind. Just that strange, narrow lane of mowed grass, bisecting the neat yard like an intrusion. It was passive, but undeniably invasive. Someone had come onto her property, not to vandalize, to claim. She walked the perimeter carefully, noting the cut patterns, trying to estimate what kind of mower had been used. The path was uneven, suggesting a handheld push model. Likely one of the older gas-powered ones with a dull blade, leaving behind frayed tips on the grass. She couldn't say when it had been done. She hadn't checked the yard that morning before leaving, and the weather had been dry for days. No telltale signs of recent activity. She stood on the porch, arms crossed, staring at the path until the dusk swallowed its outline. That night, she reviewed the security footage from her front door camera. Not a high-end system, just a basic motion sensor unit that recorded 10-second clips when movement was detected. Around 10:43 a.m., the lens captured a figure in khaki pants and a dark hoodie entering her front lawn from the east corner. The person moved quickly, pushing a mower along the grass with mechanical focus. The footage only caught a brief glimpse before the camera shut off. Just 10 seconds of grainy black and white, no clear facial features, and the sound of the mower faint but distinct. In the next clip, 2 minutes later, the figure had already moved out of frame, vanishing along the same side path. Lena didn't call the police. She knew better. Trespassing cases without property damage or identity confirmation went nowhere. A person mowing part of her lawn wouldn't even generate a citation, let alone an investigation. She knew the law too well to waste time seeking help from a system not designed to handle this type of violation. Instead, she made 3 calls the next morning. One to her office assistant to request all property overlay files submitted to the county over the past 2 years for her neighborhood. One to a legal intern she mentored, asking him to quietly check if any new neighborhood ordinances had been filed with the county clerk from Forest Glen's residential committee. And the third to a private mapping contractor who had previously worked on several of her public infrastructure cases. By noon, she had responses. There were no new county filings from Forest Glen in the past 24 months. The only overlay map on record was dated 4 years prior and clearly delineated her property as fully private, with no shared maintenance zones or common utility corridors. The internal maintenance rule cited in the response letter, Order Number 17, did not appear in any public records or municipal zoning documents. In effect, it had no legal standing. It was fiction. What disturbed Lena more was the final report she received from the mapping contractor. As a favor, he had analyzed recent drone images of the block, comparing publicly available satellite captures with county-registered plot data. In his findings, he noted that her lawn had recently been listed as part of a beautification zone in a private app used by local landscaping contractors. It appeared that her address had been tagged for inclusion in a community mowing rotation. Someone had digitally submitted her lawn as communal upkeep property. The contractor couldn't confirm who made the submission. It was an unverified user account, but the inclusion timestamp was just 8 days ago, around the time she received the first notice. Now it was a pattern. First came the letter, then the veiled threat, then the intrusion, then the digital reclassification. The moves weren't legal, but they were coordinated. She wasn't facing a single neighbor with a grudge. She was facing a collective effort to push her into conformity, using every tool short of open aggression. The final push came not in the form of another letter or warning, but through a casual conversation Lena overheard at the small park 3 blocks from her house. She wasn't trying to eavesdrop. She had taken her coffee there for a walk, hoping to spend 10 quiet minutes near the trees. As she passed a picnic bench where 3 residents sat discussing upcoming seasonal cleanups, one voice, male, nasal, vaguely amused, said, "It's always the ones who think they're above the rules that end up learning the hard way. That one house on the hill? She'll come around eventually. They always do." No names, no accusations, just tone. Lena kept walking, face neutral, heart steady, mind already turning. She had seen this before, not in neighborhoods but in small-town councils and corporate development boards. The soft threats, the backdoor reclassifications, the erasure of autonomy not through lawsuits but pressure campaigns. Only this time, it wasn't just about legality. It was about ownership, of space, of action, of silence. She went home, opened her laptop, and began to build a file. Not a legal case, not yet. A map, a matrix. Every step they had taken, every rule they had cited, every move they had made that wasn't backed by law. She wasn't going to respond with escalation. She was going to respond with documentation. Because when the real conflict came, and it would, Lena wouldn't just be right. She would be ready. Lena didn't rush into confrontation. She never had. Her strength came from the discipline to wait, to build pressure under the surface until the facts she collected could be wielded like precision tools, not blunt instruments. And so, after assembling her preliminary file on what was clearly an orchestrated attempt to coerce her compliance, she didn't march into the community office demanding answers, nor did she send a series of threatening letters. Instead, she made one small but significant move. She filed a quiet inquiry with the county assessor's office, requesting an official review of her parcel's current classification and zoning. It was a simple bureaucratic step, something most people wouldn't notice. But it triggered an internal audit of any recent submissions or adjustments made to her address, both physical and digital. It was a standard procedure, but for someone attempting to manipulate or misrepresent her property on official systems, it was a tripwire. 3 days after the request was filed, the assessor's office contacted her to confirm something she had suspected. There had been a temporary, informal tag added to her lot in the contractor's shared platform, an annotation classifying her front yard as under cooperative management pending resolution. The tag had no legal standing, but it had been used by the EIBUS regional landscaping provider to assign her address to a shared maintenance route. It had been submitted manually from an internal access account not normally granted to residents. The entry was flagged as irregular and had now been removed thanks to her inquiry. They couldn't tell her who had added it. Data privacy rules prevented the disclosure. But the implications were clear. Someone within the system, someone with access, had deliberately overridden her legal property designation. The very next day, Lena received another letter. This time it came in a large envelope with a laminated cover sheet and multiple pages attached. It looked almost professional. Almost. The letter was from the Forest Glen Community Improvement Council, a name that hadn't appeared in any previous correspondence. The council, according to the document, had recently held a private vote to formally expand the neighborhood's maintenance area, citing aesthetic continuity concerns and safety of shared visual corridors. Lena's property was specifically named as one of 3 parcels that now fell under the Enhanced Oversight Zone, subject to additional coordination requirements and service fees. There were several problems with the document, not the least of which was the fact that the so-called council did not exist in any municipal record or within the covenants of the development. The formatting of the letter mimicked official notices but lacked jurisdictional markers, and the vote it referenced was undocumented and unverifiable. Worse, it was not signed by any recognized entity, just the initials FGCIC in a decorative seal with a tree in the middle. It was amateur manipulation posing as administrative process, but done just well enough to deceive a resident unfamiliar with the limits of neighborhood power. Lena saw it for what it was, an escalation and a desperate one. She didn't respond. Instead, she archived the documents, scanned them, and added them to her case file. now growing thick with inconsistencies and procedural violations. And then, as calmly as she could, she called the city attorney's liaison for land use complaints and opened an inquiry, not about her neighborhood, but about the registered legal standing of so-called community improvement councils operating outside of chartered associations. The conversation was brief. The liaison confirmed that no such entity had standing unless formally chartered, and even then, it could not modify land use designations or assign financial obligations to residents without full city oversight. Lena thanked her, took notes, and logged the call. The next physical escalation came 4 days later. She returned home late from work, and as she pulled into her driveway, her headlights caught the glint of metal in the grass. It was a small yard sign, professionally printed with the emblem of the fake council and bold red text reading, "Maintenance non-compliant property, under review." It had been staked just inside her property line, angled to face the street as though to shame her in front of passing cars. It wasn't just offensive, it was a direct visual manipulation. From the road, it would look like her house had violated some legitimate standard, as if she were unclean, disruptive, defective. Lena stepped out of the car, walked up to the sign, and pulled it from the ground with a smooth, practiced motion. She turned it over. On the back, someone had written a message in marker. "Compliance builds community." No name, no initials, just a smiley face. That night, Lena didn't sleep. She sat at her desk, her computer glowing with open tabs. Parcel records, HOA regulation comparisons from surrounding districts, case law on community-based overreach. She reviewed state codes, drafted outlines, and organized her documentation chronologically. Around 2 a.m., she made one final move. She submitted a formal complaint to the Office of Consumer Protection, citing fraudulent service representation, misuse of private property data, and coercive billing practices by an unrecognized entity. She knew the filing wouldn't stop the signs or the letters, but it would trigger a mandatory review window, during which the parties in question would have to cease collection activity or risk fines. And that's when the retaliation turned personal. The morning after her complaint was submitted, Lena walked out to her yard to find her sprinklers had been capped. The water lines were intact, but the sprinkler heads had been physically removed and replaced with rubber plugs, as though someone had come during the night and quietly neutered her irrigation system. There was no debris, no footprints in the mulch, just a subtle silence in the air where water should have hissed and misted over the grass. It was an act of quiet sabotage. She filed a police report, not because she expected immediate action, but because paper trails matter. Then she replaced the sprinkler heads herself, this time with locking covers. She also ordered a motion-activated floodlight and mounted it beneath the eaves, aimed directly at the front lawn. Not for deterrence, for illumination. If they wanted to perform at night, she'd give them a stage, but she didn't stop there. The next day, Lena sent a certified letter to the Forest Glen Improvement Council, addressed to their mailbox at the community office, demanding a full ledger of their financial activity, meeting records and membership rosters under the sunshine. Disclosure Ordinance, a state-level rule requiring transparency from any group attempting to levy public fees or assert administrative authority over residential conduct. She knew they wouldn't respond. That was the point. Then she called an old colleague, a systems analyst now working for a city tech contractor. She asked for one favor: a pattern scan of metadata in recent online service orders submitted under her address. Within 48 hours, he found 3, all linked to an IP address geolocated to a home 3 doors down, Karen Whitmore's. The results didn't surprise her, but what did surprise her was the timing. The first service tag request, the one that had placed her home into the landscaper's system, had been submitted the morning after their first phone call. The day Karen had laughed and said, "It's just how we do things here." That evening, Lena stood at her kitchen window and watched the street. Karen was out on her porch, pruning hedges with slow, deliberate movements, sipping something from a mug between snips. There was no tension, no pretense. Just quiet rhythm. But Lena wasn't interested in confrontation, not yet. She didn't need Karen's confession. She had the evidence. She had the receipts. And now she had the city's eyes on the file. This wasn't a war of neighbors. This was the quiet destruction of a false authority, and Lena intended to dismantle it one statute at a time. Lena wasn't waiting for resolution. She was waiting for exposure. Everything that had happened so far, The false notices, the unauthorized landscaping, the sign on her lawn, had been designed not to win a legal battle but to push her into quiet submission. The people behind it were not interested in truth or enforcement. They were interested in power, the kind of small-town social dominance that depended on silence and appearance. But Lena was not bred for silence, and she did not care for appearance. She had built her career around due process and structural discipline. Now, with her documentation in order, her complaint in review, and a trail of digital fingerprints leading back to Karen Whitmore's doorstep, it was time to initiate the first formal maneuver that would bring what was underground into daylight. She filed a petition with the Municipal Council to request a public review of the Forest Glen Community Improvement Council's activities, citing irregularities in FE collection, property access, and unregulated digital submissions. The city clerk, a reserved woman named Emily Henley, whom Lena had crossed paths with professionally, handled the petition without resistance. It was clean, legally sound, and submitted with a comprehensive appendix of supporting documents. Within 48 hours, the petition was confirmed for placement on the docket of the next zoning and regulatory hearing. Lena hadn't asked for a court hearing. She had asked for an audit, a structured inspection of how a neighborhood group had begun to exert what looked like unlicensed administrative influence over private property. 2 days later, a notice went out to every home in the neighborhood, informing them of the pending review. That was when the atmosphere changed. The smiles at mailboxes became curt nods. Conversation stopped as Lena walked by. Someone began letting their dog urinate near her mailbox repeatedly. She found footprints in the flower bed one morning. Small things, petty and juvenile, but deliberate. She noted them all. It was the slow circling of a community that no longer saw her as new or distant, but as a threat. Someone who had turned a quiet power structure into a matter of public record. The escalation came not in words, but in strategy. One evening, after returning from a meeting with a developer downtown, Lena noticed a cluster of cars parked near the central green area, where the community notice board stood. A crowd of 15 or 20 residents had gathered under the low-hanging lights, sipping wine from plastic cups and talking in hushed tones. Karen was there, standing near the bulletin board, gesturing with one hand as if delivering a casual speech. There were no loud arguments, no dramatic finger-pointing, just posturing. A quiet performance for whoever might be watching. The next morning, Lena found a flyer tucked under her windshield wiper. It was printed in color and styled like a neighborhood update. At first glance, it looked harmless, an announcement of upcoming landscaping cycles and parking reminders. But buried in the bottom third, written in neutral but unmistakable language, was a paragraph about residents who are currently engaged in disruptive legal action against long-standing community practices. It advised neighbors to report unusual conduct to the Committee for Internal Review. There was no name attached, but everyone knew who it was meant for. Lena didn't retaliate. She documented the flyer, photographed it against her windshield with the timestamp from her dashboard, and filed a supplemental complaint. That afternoon, she received an official notice from the city confirming the audit of Forest Glen's local governance was scheduled to begin within 10 business days. Inspectors would arrive, not as law enforcement officers, but as administrative reviewers with authority to question documentation, interview residents, and verify claims of financial misrepresentation or jurisdictional overreach. That night, Lena took a walk around the neighborhood. The air was heavy, the temperature high enough to bring out the churring insects and the distant hum of AC units. She walked slowly, not to be seen, but to see. Every third lawn had a contractor's sign stuck in it, as if in sudden solidarity with the sanctioned service. A coordinated show. It didn't matter that the signs were likely placed hours earlier for this very moment. The illusion was the point. To the average observer, it looked like consensus. A visual argument against her complaint. And then she saw it. A man she didn't recognize standing on her curb with a clipboard. He was writing something, glancing at her lawn, measuring it with his eyes. He wore a polo shirt with no logo and jeans too clean for a contractor. When she approached, he smiled faintly and introduced himself as Robbie from Property Aesthetics. He said he was conducting an evaluation of optional upgrades for future community beautification phases. Lena asked him if he was hired by the city. He said no. She asked him who sent him. He paused for a beat, then said he was following up on a resident-submitted request for a visual enhancement quote. Lena asked for a business card. He didn't have one. She took his picture anyway and walked back to her porch without saying another word. Later that evening, she searched for property aesthetics online and found no registered business by that name within a 100-mile radius. The man was a plant, likely hired by Karen or someone from her circle to create the impression that Lena's property was under scrutiny. The goal wasn't damage, it was erosion of privacy, of confidence, of routine. But Lena didn't feel eroded. She felt sharp. At exactly 8 north the next morning, she called the zoning board office and submitted a statement of supplemental context for the upcoming hearing, including her notes, the photo of Robbie, and the new flyer. The hearing, she learned, had gained unexpected attention. A local legal blog had picked up the audit notice after someone on the board leaked the agenda. The story framed it as a case of neighborhood overreach under the guise of voluntary order. And commenters were already debating whether community boards had too much soft power. That same day, the city notified Karen Whitmore in writing that she and any other self-identified representatives of the Forest Glen Community Improvement Council would be required to provide all meeting notes, financial activity, and resident communications for the past 18 months. The language was specific. Failure to comply would result in formal investigation and potential sanctions. The timeline was no longer in Lena's control. It had entered the system. She watched the neighborhood hold its breath. Some of the contractor's signs began to disappear from lawns overnight. The polite nods returned from 2 neighbors. Someone offered to return her trash bins from the curb. No one said a word about the audit. The silence now was heavier, not of confidence, but of calculation. Lena didn't gloat. She didn't smile at her small victory. She knew the real fight hadn't even started. The audit would bring facts to light, but it wouldn't change culture. These people had operated unchecked for years, believing that social cohesion gave them authority. Now, confronted with the possibility that their influence was not only unofficial but potentially unlawful, they were backing off. Not out of remorse, but preservation. And in that moment, Lena understood something deeper than rules and violations. The real threat wasn't misused power. It was unchallenged tradition. And once you drew blood from a system like that, it didn't surrender. It adapted. The first indication that the audit was having unintended consequences came not from the city, but from Lena's mail slot. A formal-looking envelope bearing the familiar serif font of the Forest Glen Improvement Council arrived early on a Tuesday morning. She noticed it as she stepped out to retrieve the newspaper, something she rarely did except on days when she anticipated official correspondence. The letter inside was brief, typed, and almost apologetically worded. It thanked her for her ongoing participation in the civic process, then informed her that, until further notice, the $1,000 annual maintenance assessment would be suspended as a gesture of good faith pending the audit's conclusion. It made no mention of any admission of wrongdoing or any mistake in the classification of her property. It also included a veiled suggestion that should she wish to reinstate the service contract voluntarily, she could do so with a streamlined community member discount. There was no signature, no return contact, just a phone number that rang to a generic voicemail when dialed. Lena didn't respond. She scanned the document and filed it with the others. But the very next day, retaliation returned in a new form. No longer through paperwork or signage, but through the landscape itself. When she came home that evening, she noticed the grass along the far edge of her property had been cut again. This time, not in a straight line, but in a jagged pattern, sloping unevenly and intruding well into the mulch bed she'd installed weeks ago. Several low garden lights had been pulled from the soil and tossed aside. One had been snapped in half, the top portion lying near the driveway like a broken antenna. There were no signs of forced entry, no damage to the fence, no footprints distinguishable enough to trace. Whoever had done it had taken their time and then cleaned up just enough to avoid obvious suspicion. An act of cosmetic sabotage designed to be noticed but not provable. Lena took photos of everything, time-stamped them, measured the disturbed area, and once again filed a police report. Not with the hope of arrest, but to expand the record. Afterwards, she made another quiet call, this time to the city's code enforcement liaison, asking for a temporary review of external maintenance activities within her subdivision, citing escalating unsanctioned alterations to residential landscapes. She didn't mention Karen. She didn't need to. By this point, the audit had already elevated her file within the bureaucracy. Every submission she made now triggered a faster response. What Lena didn't expect was the next move, a coordinated campaign of complaints submitted under her address. Over the next week, she received 6 separate notices from various city departments. One cited an improperly placed trash bin, another referenced excessive grass height near the mailbox. A third alleged unauthorized outdoor lighting, and yet another claimed a violation of local noise ordinances based on a report of construction sounds past curfew. Each was dated within 48 hours of each other. Each bore a different internal case number, and each was demonstrably false. Lena hadn't had any construction at her home. Her lighting fixtures had been installed 6 months prior with proper permits. The trash bin had been placed curbside within the correct time window. She suspected that the noise complaint was a reference to a delivery truck that had stopped near her home one evening, but she hadn't even ordered anything. The pattern was clear. The system was being weaponized against her by someone who understood its loopholes and delays. Most of these notices would take weeks to resolve, and in the meantime, they could appear on her record as outstanding issues. Instead of responding to each individually, Lena submitted a single umbrella report to the city ombudsman, requesting an audit of complaint origins and IP submission logs, citing potential abuse of the municipal reporting portal. Then she did something she hadn't done before. She walked next door and rang Karen Whitmore's doorbell. It wasn't a confrontation. She didn't raise her voice. She simply asked if Karen knew whether any local residents were participating in a neighborhood-wide audit of residential compliance reporting. Karen, wearing an apricot cardigan and holding a cup of tea, smiled pleasantly and said she had no idea what those types of systems even were, adding that she'd barely figured out how to use her own email. Lena thanked her, stepped back onto the porch and left. She didn't believe a word of it. Karen was not technologically illiterate. She had submitted digital landscaping orders, issued internal council newsletters formatted like marketing brochures, and once uploaded a video to the neighborhood site highlighting exemplary front yard arrangements. Her performance at the door wasn't a denial. It was a signal that Lena's pressure was working and that Karen was adapting by distancing herself. 2 nights later, Lena's mailbox was opened and left ajar. Nothing was taken, nothing added. Just left slightly bent like a hand had hesitated halfway through a motion. She replaced it the next morning, installing a tamper-proof latch and notifying the local postal inspector of the incident. That afternoon, the first of the city inspectors arrived to begin the official audit of the Forest Glen Improvement Council. Lena watched them from her window as they walked the cul-de-sac with clipboards and tablets. Not in uniform, but clearly marked as city representatives. They took photos. They spoke to residents. Some people smiled and chatted amiably. Others closed their doors. The inspectors didn't knock on hers. They didn't need to. Her submission had already included everything they needed. The next afternoon, Lena received an unmarked manila envelope tucked under her front mat. Inside was a printout of her property line, with annotations written in red pen, showing speculative alternative boundaries. One of the notes read, "Community visual flow zone begins here," with an arrow pointing 2 feet into her lawn. Another said, "Confirm grandfathered setback compliance." The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the language wasn't. It was the same blend of pseudo-legal jargon that Karen and her group had been using since the beginning. Lena scanned the document, logged it, and filed a harassment report with the city's legal advisory board. Then, for the first time, she sent a cease and desist letter, not to Karen directly, but to the listed PO, box associated with the Forest Glen Council, outlining the continued attempts at intimidation, the falsified classifications, and the misuse of city systems. She CC'd the Municipal Audit Department, the Office of Consumer Affairs, and the Regional Housing Oversight Committee. The letter was concise, dispassionate, and packed with citations. The following morning, a different kind of silence descended on the neighborhood. No one waved, no one made eye contact. A contractor's truck parked across the street reversed direction without even beginning a job. The bulletin board near the community garden was empty, stripped of flyers, notices, and decorative pinwheels. It was as if the entire area had gone into lockstep retreat. But Lena didn't need social validation. She needed closure. That evening, her phone rang. It was a staff attorney from the city's regulatory division. She informed Lena that the preliminary audit findings had raised several red flags, including inconsistencies in how assessments were determined, irregularities in complaint patterns tied to certain addresses, and improper data entry linked to specific user profiles. The city would be issuing a temporary suspension of all council activity within Forest Glen, pending further review. All financial collections would cease. All member communication systems would be frozen for access analysis. In short, the mechanism behind the harassment was about to be dismantled, at least in the short term. But Lena knew better than to assume this meant victory. Power, when cornered, didn't vanish. It receded, restructured, rebranded, and sometimes it retaliated in the final moment before dissolution. That night, she received a voicemail from a blocked number. It was a woman's voice, flat and unrecognizable, stating simply, "You think you're cleaning house, but the foundation's still ours. Don't forget that." Lena saved the message. The game had shifted again. The campaign of pressure had become personal, anonymous, and desperate. And that, she knew, meant her case was closer to resolution than ever before. Because desperation was always the last breath before collapse. The voicemail didn't rattle Lena, but it did confirm one essential truth. The campaign against her had become fully untethered from procedure and was now a matter of raw personal resentment. That message, with its cryptic warning about foundations and ownership, was less a threat than a confession. A signal that those behind the facade of committee authority now understood their structure was crumbling, and all they had left was implication. Lena didn't return fire. She filed the recording with the city's legal intake team, appended it to her ongoing harassment report, and flagged her file for audio transcription. Within the hour, a compliance officer acknowledged receipt. The process was still grinding forward, and that was enough. But as the city's hand grew heavier, Karen and her loyalists grew bolder in more subtle, personal ways. The real climax began not with another letter or violation, but with the arrival of a formal notice taped to Lena's front door in plain sight. It was a city-issued audit summary, signed and embossed, confirming that the Forest Glen Improvement Council was now officially designated as non-compliant with operational transparency standards. The notice didn't carry the drama of a lawsuit or the weight of criminal charges, but for a neighborhood built on the illusion of internal control, it was a public strike. Lena pulled it from the glass with a steady hand, knowing the whole street had likely watched it go up. The audit results were clear. Unauthorized collection of maintenance fees, improper use of third-party landscaping services without resident consent, false representations of policy authority, and a failure to establish legal legitimacy under state housing association requirements. In one blow, everything Karen and her allies had built was reduced to administrative rubble. But the pushback came quickly. That evening, Lena's electricity flickered repeatedly. At first, she assumed it was unrelated, but when the power dipped again and again, each time for no more than 2 seconds, long enough to restart her router, to reset her clocks, to interrupt her evening work, she began to suspect otherwise. When she stepped outside to check the breaker panel, she noticed something more disturbing. The lockbox on her outdoor utility closet had been removed. Not broken, not forced. Unscrewed and carefully set on the ground beside the panel as if someone had paused halfway through a job and walked away. It was surgical. It was meant to be found. Lena called the utility provider, filed a tampering report, then had a technician inspect the lines. Nothing had been altered internally, but the technician confirmed what she already suspected. Someone had accessed the breaker housing directly. Whether to install a time disruption or simply to unsettle her, the effect was the same. She documented the incident and submitted it as an escalation tied to her ongoing case. The city responded by moving her file into the threat to resident category and dispatched a representative from the Municipal Security Review Board to conduct an in-person interview. It wasn't a police matter, not officially, but it marked the first time Lena saw the system react to her case, not as a legal anomaly, but as a security concern. The city now recognized that what had started as a zoning dispute had become something else entirely. An attempt to isolate and undermine her through tactics that blurred the line between harassment and sabotage. The next morning, Lena woke to find a package on her doorstep. It had no return address, no shipping label, just her name, handwritten in bold black ink. Inside was a single item, a rusted pair of garden shears with a tag tied to one handle. The tag read, "Your rules don't cut here." There were no fingerprints, no traceable prints, Just the object and the message. Symbolic, personal, and deliberately theatrical. Lena didn't flinch. She photographed the shears, packaged them into a sealed evidence bag, and dropped them off at the local precinct with a report. The officer behind the desk asked if she knew who sent it. She didn't answer. It didn't matter. The pattern was undeniable, the council was gone, but the personality cult behind it was still clinging to its last vestiges of intimidation, trying to imply that Lena's fight had stirred something primal and irreversible. Later that day, the city issued a neighborhood-wide bulletin, formally dissolving the Forest Glen Council. All digital portals were shut down. All payment accounts frozen. The mailbox used for council correspondence was emptied by city clerks and confiscated. In an extraordinary measure, the municipal government installed a temporary community liaison to oversee neighborhood affairs until a new resident advisory board could be democratically formed under full compliance standards. Lena read the bulletin twice. The language was clinical but final. The power structure that had tormented her for months was dismantled, not with fury but with policy. Still, Karen was nowhere to be seen. Her house remained quiet, blinds drawn, the front porch empty. No press statements, no dramatic confrontations, no parting words. Just absence. Lena assumed she was watching everything unfold from behind her curtains, calculating her next move, waiting for a chance to reappear under a new title or through a proxy. But Lena had accounted for that. The final step she took was not legal, but social. She hosted a quiet, invitation-only meeting with several residents who had previously ignored her. Those who had kept their distance but hadn't joined the smear efforts. In a small circle in her backyard, over coffee and the gentle sound of lawn sprinklers, she explained exactly what had happened. Not as a lecture, but as a timeline. She showed them the notices, the false documents, the tampered landscaping photos, the audit summary, and the final city bulletin. She didn't ask for allegiance or apology. She asked for awareness, and that was enough. In the weeks that followed, several neighbors began cautiously reaching out. One offered to help fix a broken sprinkler. Another returned a parcel that had been mistakenly delivered. Small acts, but real. The intimidation campaign had ended not with a confrontation, but with the erosion of belief. The illusion of authority was gone. The system had been broken apart from the inside out, not by outrage, but by unyielding process. Lena stood on her front porch one quiet Saturday morning, sipping her coffee as the sun cut low across the street. No signs adorned her lawn, no flyers, no symbols, no warnings. Just trimmed grass, cut at a height she chose herself, edging sharp and perfect. The council was gone. The rules were reset. And in the space left behind, silence finally meant peace. The silence that followed was not immediate, nor was it absolute. It arrived slowly, like mist rolling in after a long, punishing storm, soaking into everything without announcement or celebration. There was no moment of public recognition, no applause for Lena's efforts, no sudden wave of contrition from the neighbors who had watched from behind safe blinds as the machinery of soft coercion worked to grind her into compliance. The end of the forest. Glen Improvement Council did not come with an apology, only with absence. Its digital presence vanished overnight. Its mailbox keys were turned over to the city, and the P.O., box it had used for over a decade, was sealed permanently. The page on the community site that had once hosted notices and passive-aggressive reminders now displayed a default error screen. 404, page not found, which Lena found poetically sufficient. Karen Whitmore did not return to prominence. Her house remained occupied, the lights inside visible on a timer schedule, but she was rarely seen in person. Some said she had gone to stay with family out of state. Others claimed she was simply taking a step back from community involvement. Lena did not concern herself with the details. What mattered was that no one else had stepped forward to take her place. There were no immediate successors, no emerging voices claiming the need to restore order. It was as if the web of influence had unraveled so completely that no one dared touch its threads again. Life resumed. The city-appointed liaison managed local matters with efficient neutrality, enforcing actual ordinances rather than invented ones, ensuring municipal services ran without political entanglement. Notices, when issued, were signed by real officials and carried legal context. No more mystery letters. No more decorative emblems masquerading as governance. Lena resumed her work schedule with quiet satisfaction, shifting her legal focus to a regional infrastructure project that had been waiting for her attention. Her mornings returned to normal. Coffee at sunrise, lawn care by hand, and long, wordless walks before her first Zoom call of the day. Occasionally there were remnants, echoes of the conflict that had reshaped her view of community. A stranger parking just a little too long near her property. A package delayed or rerouted. A car passing slowly at odd hours. But she no longer reacted with tension. The systems had been engaged, the evidence archived. She had built such a clean, airtight wall of documentation around her experience that any new attempt to harass her would collapse before it left the driveway. She didn't need to assert control. She had already claimed it. The neighborhood, stripped of its informal regime, began to shift in tone. Without the pressure to conform, residents slowly returned to their own preferences. Lawns varied in style. Decorations appeared again. Wind chimes, seasonal flags, a basketball hoop mounted to a garage that once would have drawn anonymous complaint. Even the community garden, previously micromanaged by a rotating schedule, was now tended sporadically by volunteers without hierarchy. A certain awkward civility returned, one born not of fear but of newfound independence. Lena didn't seek friendships, but she didn't resist connection either. A neighbor she had never spoken to stopped her one morning to ask about drought-resistant plants. Another knocked one afternoon to ask for a spare trash bag when his ran out. These were small moments, but they were free of performance, untainted by power dynamics or veiled judgment. That was the real reward. Not silence, not distance, but authenticity, even if brief. On the last Sunday of the month, she hosted 3 colleagues from her office for a quiet dinner on the patio. They sat under string lights she had hung herself, the same ones she'd once hesitated to install for fear of drawing aesthetic criticism. They laughed over case stories, discussed ethics and permitting procedures, and poured wine without watching the windows. One of them commented on how peaceful the neighborhood seemed. Lena didn't offer the story. She simply nodded, smiled, and said, "It is now." She kept the files, of course. Everything. Every notice, every photo, every time-stamped report, indexed and backed up in triplicate. Not for revenge, for precedent. She knew better than to assume the problem was unique to her. What had happened in Forest Glen was happening across countless other subdivisions, hidden beneath the language of tradition, decorum, and protecting value. One day she might be asked to speak on it, to testify in a larger case or advise a task force. When that time came, she would be ready. But until then, she kept her gate unlocked, not out of trust, but of clarity. Because true security didn't come from isolation or threat. It came from understanding exactly where your boundary lies and having the tools, the will, and the patience to defend it. She hadn't come to Forest Glen to fight. She had come for stillness, for routine, for a place to think between cases. What she found was a system designed to quietly dominate those who didn't obey unwritten expectations. And what she left in her wake was not just a victory over that system, but the example of what happens when someone refuses to submit. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with relentless competence. Lena never raised her voice. She never broke a rule. She simply never stopped. And in the end, that was what won.